January 6, 1945. 11 days into the Soviet encirclement of Budapest. The 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf walked away from its final defensive positions east of the city, not because they were outflanked, not because they ran out of men. They walked away because they could not sit in their own trenches anymore. The thing that drove them out was a stubby, ugly Soviet howitzer with a barrel so short it looked half-finished, sitting on a carriage borrowed from a smaller gun, wearing a muzzle brake the size of a coffee can. Soviet gunners called it the D-1. Totenkopf called it the reason their dugouts kept collapsing on top of them. Now, German artillery was supposed to be the best in the world. 4th SS Panzer Corps had veteran gun crews, layered defensive engineering, the entire reputation of the Wehrmacht behind them. So how did a hybrid Soviet howitzer, designed in 18 months, built out of leftover parts, dismantle their bridgehead in less than 2 weeks? That answer starts 4,000 kilometers from Budapest, in a freezing Soviet factory in 1942. To understand why the D-1 mattered, you have to understand what German artillery doctrine had quietly become by 1943. The Wehrmacht had poured its development effort into anti-tank guns and assault artillery, the weapons that fight forward. That left corps commanders short on counter-battery capability, the weapons that fight back. The Red Army went the other direction. They massed artillery at army and front level, stacking 152mm howitzers in layered firing positions where they could pound trench lines, strongpoints, and assembly areas. And the German response was always too late and too thin. Totenkopf's positions east of Budapest were textbook defensive work. Village strongpoints, road junctions, dug-in infantry anchored on hard cover. On paper, it should have held. But on paper does not survive 40-kilogram high-explosive shells landing on it 3 times a minute from a gun the Germans could not locate. The Wehrmacht had built technical excellence in tanks and anti-aircraft systems. They had not built the mobile heavy artillery that decides positional fighting. And that gap is exactly what the D-1 was designed to walk through. Soviet gunners positioned their batteries in wooded approaches and reverse slopes. They fired 40-kilogram shells at ranges out to 12,400 meters, dropping them down on trenches that were never built to absorb something that heavy. Each shell threw fragmentation across a wide kill zone, collapsed dugouts, and obliterated firing positions that German engineers had spent weeks building. Soviet artillery regiments could deliver more sustained heavy fire than entire German divisions could answer with. And here is the part that nobody on the German side wanted to write down. The weapon doing all of this damage had been built in a hurry, by a man under pressure, out of components that already existed. 2 years before the Budapest collapse, the situation looked different. It was autumn 1942. German forces were fighting at Stalingrad. The Red Army's existing mobile heavy howitzer, the 152mm model 1938, designated M10, was failing the Soviets on both fronts that mattered. There were not enough of them. Only 1,500 M10s had rolled off the lines between 1939 and 1941. And the ones that did exist were too heavy to keep up with the kind of war that was now eating the Eastern Front from Leningrad to the Caucasus. That problem landed on the desk of Fyodor Fyodorovich Petrov, chief designer at Plant No. 9 in Sverdlovsk. Petrov did not have years. He did not have a clean sheet. He did not have a retooled industrial base. He had wartime production schedules, a shrinking calendar, and orders to deliver heavy artillery in numbers the Red Army could actually absorb. So Petrov did what good engineers do when they have no time. He stopped designing and started borrowing. He took the proven 152.4mm barrel of the M10 howitzer, and he married it to the lighter, more mobile carriage of the 122mm M30 howitzer. Big barrel, small chassis. The kind of pairing that should not work on paper. It almost did not. The M10's barrel generated recoil forces the M30 carriage was never built to absorb. Every shot threatened to tear the lighter running gear apart. Petrov's team fixed that with a single, brutal addition: a massive double-baffle muzzle brake bolted to the end of the barrel that bled off enough recoil to keep the carriage alive through repeated firing cycles. That muzzle brake is why the D-1 looks the way it does. It is also why it exists at all. The whole design philosophy was visible compromise to win invisible advantages: faster production, faster deployment, and a gun that could actually be moved. From sketches to production-ready prototypes took about 18 months. The Red Army adopted the weapon in 1943 as the 152mm Howitzer model 1943, designated D-1. That timeline was not pride. That timeline was panic. Soviet engineering pragmatism met a tactical situation that needed heavy artillery faster than any normal development cycle could deliver. The numbers on the finished gun explain why Totenkopf eventually had nowhere to hide. Combat weight came in at 3,650 kilograms, far lighter than comparable heavy howitzers, while still firing a full-caliber 152mm shell. The barrel measured 29.6 calibers in length, around 4.5 meters of rifled tube, shorter than dedicated gun howitzers, but long enough for the close support work that defined the Eastern Front. An 8-man crew could sustain about 3 rounds per minute, cycling the interrupted screw breech and loading 40-kilogram shells by hand. The main projectile was the OF 530 high-explosive fragmentation shell, a separate loading round designed to fragment the steel casing into killing shrapnel. Muzzle velocity reached 508 meters per second, throwing that 40-kilogram round out to 12,400 meters against field fortifications, gun positions, and assembly areas, and the ammunition was already in the supply chain. The D-1 ate existing Soviet 152mm stocks, which meant no new shell program had to be funded, designed, or trained on. Petrov had not just built a weapon, he had built one that the rest of the Red Army was already feeding. That muzzle brake stayed the visual signature of the gun, the dual baffles redirecting propellant gases hard enough to spare the M30 carriage. Standard artillery tractors could emplace and displace the weapon, which meant Soviet gunners moved this thing at the speed of the war, not at the speed of a fortress gun. In the rapid advances and defensive shifts of 1943 and 1944, that mattered more than any single specification. The design did not win because it was perfect. It won because it was optimized for the only 3 things that decide artillery wars: production speed, logistical compatibility, and battlefield mobility. The first D-1s reached Soviet artillery units in late 1943. From day one, Soviet doctrine pushed them up to corps and army level, not down to division. They were not meant to sit with a single infantry unit. They were meant to swing across a front, concentrate against priority targets, and then leave before the Germans could plot grid coordinates on them. Fire brigade work. Pick a sector, dismantle it, displace to the next one. By December 1944, D-1 howitzers were embedded in corps artillery regiments and army-level breakthrough formations across multiple active fronts. Soviet artillery doctrine called for massed fires from multiple batteries, overlapping destruction zones that could neutralize entire defensive sectors before infantry and armor stepped through the wreckage. Which brings us back to a wooded reverse slope east of Budapest, where 4 batteries of D-1s were settling into firing positions that Totenkopf's spotters would never accurately locate. At Budapest, D-1 batteries occupied positions in wooded areas and reverse slopes, dropping plunging fire onto Totenkopf's trench networks while staying covered from German counter-battery efforts. The late December encirclement phase saw sustained fire missions against village strongpoints, road junctions, and assembly areas that the Germans needed to hold their defense together. Soviet artillery reports credited 152mm fire with destroying dugouts and firing points, suppressing enemy batteries, and breaking up the counterattack concentrations. Totenkopf kept trying to assemble against the tightening ring. The geometry of the ground around Budapest played to the D-1's strengths. Maximum range was less important than the ability to scoot a battery into a new firing position quickly and resume sustained fire against targets between 3,000 and 8,000 meters. Heavier howitzers could not reach those positions. Lighter howitzers could not crack the reinforced fieldworks and masonry buildings the SS were sheltering in. The D-1 sat in the exact gap between the two, and that gap is where Totenkopf was dying. German recognition of the threat shows up in cold print in 4th SS Panzer Corps records during the encirclement. Situation reports describe heavy 15.2 centimeter fire making forward positions untenable, forcing repeated displacement of command posts and artillery positions. Totenkopf's own regimental records describe the abandonment of exposed trenches and the rerouting of supply columns through covered approaches just to avoid observed artillery that German counter-battery assets could not effectively suppress. Read that again. Elite SS records, written by their own staff, documenting the moment their defensive systems stopped working. The German response showed what happens when a tactical problem has no clean tactical answer. 4th SS Panzer Corps shortened occupied frontages to reduce exposure. They displaced artillery when Soviet fire got concentrated. They shifted supply and reinforcement to night movement. Engineering units burned more and more labor on repairing roads, communications, and fortifications that were getting hammered faster than they could be rebuilt. A repair cycle running slower than the bombardment cycle, that is the math that loses defensive campaigns. German war diaries do not give clean casualty tallies for what the D-1 was doing. They give something more damning: descriptions of abandoned positions, broken movement schedules, and engineering workloads that kept climbing. The records show Totenkopf walking away from trench lines entirely, rerouting approach roads to dodge observed fire zones, and concentrating their defense in the few areas where natural cover gave any protection from plunging artillery fire. These are operational losses, even when no one bled for them on a given day. They are the slow erosion of a defensive system, and they are the prelude to abandonment. And underneath all of it sat the resource mismatch that decided the entire artillery war on the Eastern Front. Each D-1 was a simplified piece of manufacturing, leveraging M30 carriage components and M10 barrel tooling already in production. The German countermeasures, on the other hand, required heavy field engineering, displacement of equipment, and combat troops pulled off the line to dig defensive construction tasks that ate hundreds of man-hours per battery position and only brought temporary protection against the next bombardment. Plant No. 9 in Sverdlovsk produced approximately 700 D-1 howitzers across the war, with output concentrated in 1943 and 1944. The schedule reflected the weapon's simplified design and a Soviet commitment to quantity over perfection. Each gun was not cheap, but each gun forced the Germans to spend exponentially more labor on defensive responses than the Soviet Union spent on the howitzer itself. The Wehrmacht was burning a defensive economy to counter a Soviet production economy, and the defensive economy ran out first. Manufacturing continued at Plant No. 9 until 1945 on simplified production techniques that reused existing subassemblies instead of starting from scratch. The hybrid approach let Soviet industry field effective heavy howitzers without the material burden and stretched timelines a wholly new weapon would have demanded. The D-1 stayed in Soviet service until the 1970s, eventually replaced by the D-20, a 152mm gun howitzer with improved range and a more modern carriage. But the same role in Corps and Army artillery, that extended service life, is its own quiet verdict. A weapon thrown together in 18 months in wartime was still good enough to keep firing 30 years later. Export versions reached China in the 1950s, as the Type 54 152mm howitzer, giving the People's Liberation Army effective artillery that stayed in service through multiple conflicts. The 152.4mm cartridge family that defined the D-1's ammunition compatibility outlived the weapon itself, carrying forward through successive Soviet artillery systems that kept logistical standardization across decades of technical development. Various forces employed D-1s in regional conflicts, where formations pulled from reserve stocks for indirect fire support against fixed positions and area targets. The weapon won through relentless adequacy. Simple enough to manufacture under siege conditions at Sverdlovsk, effective enough to justify frontline distribution across multiple army groups, durable enough to outlast both the regime that built it and the war that gave it purpose. The systematic artillery campaigns that cracked open Soviet breakthrough operations needed a weapon so fundamentally sound that the Red Army did not have to improve it. They only had to copy it over and over again. Totenkopf's prolonged struggle at Budapest is the cleanest demonstration of how that math actually worked. The side that could produce adequate weapons faster than the enemy could counter them would eventually own the ground. The D-1 delivered heavy artillery effects through simplified engineering that multiplied Soviet firepower while consuming significant but manageable industrial resources. The position's 4th SS Panzer Corps could not hold against sustained 152mm fire, became the template for German defensive failure across the rest of the Eastern Front. German technical excellence built better tanks, better optics, better small arms, and lost to a stubby Soviet howitzer that did one job extremely well, on time and in numbers. If you want more deep dives into the weapons and the industrial decisions that actually determined the largest war in history, subscribe now. Next week, we break down the Soviet rocket artillery system that turned entire German battalions into smoking ground in under a minute.